Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the carnival of economic absurdity where tariffs are the new, must-have accessory, in the Trump era. Just when you thought American companies could catch a break, President Trump has decided to spice up his trade policy menu with tariffs that leave small businesses in a pickle. Imagine a scenario where even the tiniest American firms, those that proudly employ nearly half of our workforce, are forced to endure cost hikes that could wipe out up to 33% of their anticipated profit margins, just as they are trying to expand and innovate. Take Florida's Jay Foreman, CEO of Basic Fun Inc., the company behind beloved icons like the Care Bears and Tonka trucks, who now finds himself in a real-life episode of Tariff Survivor. Earlier, his imports from China were safely off the hook. But faster than you can say, inflation, a fresh 10% duty on imported toy components has arrived, right on schedule to ruin all his third-quarter deals. The irony is delicious. Trump, who once promised to lower prices, is now inadvertently driving them higher. Yet, our esteemed leader appears to have forgotten that the laws of economics don't care about campaign promises. The story here isn't merely about isolated pain points. What we're witnessing is a textbook demonstration of pass-through effects in global trade policy. When import tariffs are imposed, the cost is not borne solely by the government or the foreign supplier, it cascades down the supply chain. In economic theory, we call this cost-push inflation, and guess what? In our current climate, consumer prices are already rearing their ugly heads. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has already raised eyebrows by hinting at the potential inflationary impacts of this tariff frenzy. Data from recent months indicates U.S. consumer price indices have begun to climb in line with raw materials and manufacturing costs. Consider the example of Field Fastener in Rockford, Illinois. CEO Jim Derry, a man who supplies bolts and screws for everyday products, from your local football helmet to the elevator you're probably riding, has already announced that his customers are in for a price hike. The fact that even a commodity as mundane as a bolt is being jostled around by macroeconomic policy speaks volumes. When you start raising costs on the basics, everyone is forced to pay. But why, you might ask, would a president known for his business-friendly rhetoric impose policies that hurt his very constituents? Perhaps it's not a matter of poor planning but rather a miscalculation of the magical, trickle-down theory. Instead of triggering a rain of prosperity from the heavens, these tariffs are more akin to a drought that parches small businesses, leaving them scrambling to either absorb costs or pass them on, and facing potential customer loss in both cases. For the nimble and resource-strapped small business owner, policy changes are anything but an abstract debate in Washington. Let's take a stroll through the offices of Sony Tube, a modest Florida-based firm that specializes in stainless steel tubing, valves, and fittings used by food manufacturers. CEO Todd Adams is in a holding pattern so intense it makes waiting for a government decision on infrastructure spending seem like a leisurely afternoon tea. With tariffs looming on metals and Canadian goods and an existing 10% duty on Chinese imports, Sony Tube finds itself in a state of paralysis. The company's story is all too common, as many small firms across the nation find themselves unable to absorb sudden price hikes, leaving them no option but to pass the burden onto already cautious consumers. Policymakers would do well to remember that these tiny titans form the backbone of the job market. With nearly 50% of U.S. workers employed by small businesses, decisions that stifle their growth could ripple into a broader economic slowdown. Recent surveys even suggest that business optimism, which soared to a 6-year high post-election, took a nosedive when capital expenditures plummeted to levels unseen since 1995. This volatility is not just a statistical blip, it is a harbinger of the economic malaise that might well follow if the trade war intensifies. Moreover, consider the plight of Polycraft Industries in New York. COO Darren Klein candidly admits that a mere 10% tariff can force a small to mid-sized company to rethink its entire supply chain strategy. Even a company with a bit of clout to negotiate with suppliers will eventually find that their pricing power evaporates amid fierce competition and thin profit margins. And when your input costs rise because of tariffs, you're forced into the unenviable role of either hiking prices, which could erode your customer base, or absorbing the hit and gritting your teeth while watching profits dwindle. One might argue that these tariffs were meant to revive American industry. The notion is that by making foreign products more expensive, domestic manufacturers will be incentivized to produce locally, generating jobs and stimulating economic growth. But reality, as always, is a harsh mistress. Corporate giants like General Motors have already made it clear that they are reluctant to invest in new factories or capitalize on market opportunities until the government offers some clarity on the tariff regime. This uncertainty isn't just causing anxiety among small business owners, it's fundamentally stalling business investment across the board. Consider the furniture industry, an industry in which pricing power is typically more robust. Even here, however, companies like Kevin Charles Fine Upholstery in Tupelo, Mississippi, face a double whammy. They are grappling with surging mortgage rates hovering around 7%, a figure that has many economists worried about the housing bubble's longer-term impact, alongside additional tariffs on a segment of their production that relies on imported components. While some industry voices, like President Rusty Berryhill, try to see a silver lining by touting a competitive advantage for U.S.-made products, the overarching message remains the same: uncertainty is a destroyer of investment, planning, and, ultimately, profitability. Even in industries that rely on agile adaptation, such as the mighty microgreen in Ingham, Idaho, where owner Margot Clayson stockpiled plastic trays from China in anticipation of the tariff storm, the strategy is a gamble. Yes, she saved $1,200 this year by beating the tariff deadline, but this sort of just-in-case stockpiling is simply a stopgap measure. It does not address the fundamental distortions that tariffs create in global supply chains, a reality that leaves small businesses scrambling for survival while larger corporations with bigger lobbying budgets absorb or mitigate the shocks. Another layer of this economic onion is the stark disparity in lobbying power between small businesses and their giant counterparts. When Trump's first-term trade war hit, a bewildering array of businesses secured tariff relief, but not without the heavy cost of navigating bureaucratic labyrinths, a luxury that many small and medium-sized enterprises simply cannot afford. The political cloud of corporate behemoths ensured that policymakers were more likely to deliver tailored exemptions or reimbursements when the going got tough, leaving the little guys to suffer in silence. This asymmetry is not only economically inefficient but also deeply unjust. When the burden of protectionist policies falls disproportionately on small businesses, it exacerbates income inequality and stifles competition. With nearly half of America's workforce employed by these smaller firms, the ripple effects could be widespread. In a nation where access to capital and the ability to influence policy are increasingly concentrated among the wealthy few, tariff-induced distortions risk further entrenching those differences. Turning our gaze to the inflationary front, let's delve into the classic supply and demand dynamics. When tariffs raise the cost of imported intermediate goods, a composite of everything from the metal in bolts to the plastic in trays, the supply curve shifts to the left, resulting in higher prices for consumers. Initially, it might appear that this protection will help domestic producers. However, as recent data indicates, the reality is that consumers end up paying more at the checkout. More broadly, the persistent increase in input costs contributes to an inflation spiral that necessitates tighter monetary policy. In fact, inflation has already nudged upward in scenarios like this, forcing the Federal Reserve to consider even more aggressive interest rate hikes. The irony is palpable: if the purpose of tariffs is to revive American manufacturing, the inflationary backlash could undermine the very consumer spending that drives overall economic growth. To put it in perspective, consider the U.S. inflation rate which, as per recent Bureau of Labor Statistics figures, has been trending above the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. With tariffs acting as yet another pressure point, daily transactions, from groceries to gadgets, soon feel the squeeze. This is not a problem of numbers on a page, it's a lived experience for millions. The average American, already slogging through a post-pandemic economic recovery, might find their purchasing power steadily eroded by what economists call cost-push inflation. In the grand theater of American politics, it's often said that the devil is in the details. No detail is more devilish than a tariff that sneaks up on businesses with previously locked-in prices and long-term contracts. Whether it's the costs borne by a toy manufacturer like Basic Fun Inc. or the production constraints facing polycraft industries, the harsh truth remains: such policy decisions have far-reaching consequences that ripple through every layer of the economy. While President Trump and his supporters argue that tariffs will ultimately pave the way for a resurgent American industrial base, the empirical evidence paints a different picture. Recent studies, including those from the Brookings Institution and other economic think tanks, indicate that while certain sectors might see a temporary boost, the overall impact on job creation and investment is ambiguous at best. Without clear incentives and institutional support to help small businesses transition to new supply chains or domestic alternatives, the tariff policy risks fostering a climate of chronic uncertainty. And in a world where uncertainty undermines consumer confidence and business investment, that's a recipe for economic stagnation, or worse, recession. So where does this leave us? We're at a crossroads where protectionist rhetoric meets real-world economic consequences. For the ordinary viewer, whether a consumer or a small business owner, the situation is as clear as a murky glass of water. When government policies become unpredictable and the burden of costs falls on the smallest players, the entire economy feels the sting. American ingenuity and hard work are commendable, but they cannot defy the immutable laws of supply and demand. In a tariff-induced inflationary environment, the promise of lower prices turns into a cruel joke. Recent international examples shed additional light on this dismal scenario. Countries that have taken a more multilateral approach to trade adjustments, working through organizations like the World Trade Organization, tend to experience fewer abrupt economic shocks. Meanwhile, our nation's unilateral imposition of tariffs, without reciprocal negotiations, risks isolating U.S. businesses from the global value chain. As supply chains become fractured and realigned, the hope for a robust domestic recovery dims, replaced instead by a landscape of patchwork solutions and elevated risk premiums. In summation, if we're to learn anything from this latest tranche of tariffs, it's that economic policy isn't made in a vacuum. From Jay Foreman saving his toy business one ill-timed tariff after another, to Sanitub's crippling pause on expansion, the message is clear: small businesses are the canaries in the coal mine. They signal the deeper, systemic issues that arise when government policies, no matter how well-intentioned, interfere with the natural forces of market dynamics. For the policymakers in Washington, the lesson should be as sharp as it is simple: clarity and consistency are the twin pillars necessary to foster an environment where businesses, both large and small, can thrive. Tariffs, when used indiscriminately, do nothing more than sow uncertainty, fuel inflation, and ultimately stunt the growth of our extraordinary American enterprise ecosystem. It's time for a recalibration. Instead of a barrage of unilateral tariff actions, a concerted effort to engage in fair, multilateral trade agreements may well be the wisdom that our economic community needs. Only by ensuring that protectionist measures do not inadvertently strangle the engine of our economy can we hope to avoid repeating these costly mistakes. So, dear viewers, as you sip your coffee and ponder the state of our economy, remember this: behind every policy decision lies a labyrinth of unintended consequences. In the words of a certain witty cynic of economic policy, we're all just trying to keep our heads above water, but if the water keeps rising, eventually you're going to get wet. Let's hope that our policymakers start building lifeboats rather than throwing more stones into an already choppy trade war sea. Stay smart, stay critical, and above all, stay tuned, because in this topsy-turvy world of tariffs and trade wars, there's never a dull moment in the theater of American economics.